The Veltari exploration cruiser, Seeker of Currents, had been drifting through the Gravenal corridor for 17 days, when the scanner officer let out a sound that no one on the bridge had ever heard him make before. A sharp, broken gasp that made Captain Rael Sorrenthi turn in her command chair and stare at him with all four of her pale violet eyes. "What is it?" she asked, and the officer did not answer right away, because his hands were shaking as he adjusted the readings on his console. He finally spoke, in a voice barely above a whisper, saying that there was something out there, something massive, drifting without power and without any signal, and it was bigger than anything he had ever seen on his instruments in 20 years of service. Rael stood and walked to the main display screen, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. There, in the cold black emptiness between the stars, was a shape, long and angular and brutal, stretching across several kilometers of dead space, like a sleeping predator that had been frozen in time. It was a ship, but it was unlike anything in the Galactic Concordance database. No smooth curves, no elegant design, no graceful architecture that the known species favored. Instead, it was all hard edges, and heavy armor plating, and weapon mounts that jutted from its hull like the spines of some ancient beast. Scholar Yineth, the ship's linguist and cultural expert, leaned forward from her station, with her thin fingers trembling as she enhanced the image. And when she saw the faded markings on the hull, she made a sound somewhere between a prayer and a curse. "Those markings," she said, her voice tight with a fear that she could not hide. "I have seen them in the old records, in the archives that no one reads anymore, because they are considered nothing more than history." "And ghost stories." Rael asked her what species the ship belonged to, and Yineth looked at her captain with an expression that carried 300 years of dread in it, before she answered with a single word that made everyone on the bridge go silent: humans. The word hung in the air like smoke, and every member of the crew knew what it meant, because every species in the galaxy had heard the stories, even if most of them preferred to pretend they had not. Humanity had been a young species, fierce and strange, and impossibly stubborn. And they had risen fast and burned bright before the Derelict hegemony had crushed them, in a war that lasted only 8 years, but killed billions. Earth was a dead world now, a ball of irradiated rock that the Derelict had turned into a monument to their own power. And the human colonies had been glassed one by one, until there was nothing left but ash and silence, and the occasional piece of wreckage drifting through the void. Humanity was extinct, and that was supposed to be the end of the story. Lieutenant Korvan, the ship's security chief, was a Gorath, a species known for their massive size and their 4 powerful arms, and their complete lack of anything resembling fear. But even he shifted uncomfortably when he heard the word humans spoken aloud on the bridge. He told the captain that they should leave, that there was nothing good waiting for them inside a dead human warship, and that the stories about human technology were enough to make any sensible person turn around and fly in the opposite direction. But Rael was not just any captain. She was Veltari, and her people valued knowledge above all things, and the chance to explore a ship from a species that had been dead for 3 centuries was something that she could not walk away from, no matter how much her instincts screamed at her to run. She gave the order to prepare a boarding party, and Korvan closed all 4 of his eyes for a moment, in what might have been frustration or prayer, before he nodded and went to gather his team. The boarding shuttle crossed the gap between the 2 ships in silence, and as they drew closer, the true scale of the human vessel became terrifyingly clear. It dwarfed the Seeker of Currents the way a mountain dwarfs a pebble, and its shadows swallowed their shuttle whole as they approached what appeared to be an airlock on the port side. Korvan and his team cut through the outer door with plasma torches, and when the seal broke there was no rush of air, because there had been no atmosphere inside for longer than any of them had been alive. They stepped into darkness so complete that their helmet lights seemed to be swallowed by it. The corridors were enormous, built for creatures that were supposed to be smaller than a Gorath, but designed as though the builders expected war to find its way inside the ship itself. The walls were thick and heavy and lined with blast-resistant plating, and every doorway was reinforced enough to serve as a defensive position. They found the marks of battle everywhere, scoring from energy weapons on the walls, dents in the metal where something had struck with tremendous force, and long scratches that looked like they had been made by claws, which made no sense, because humans did not have claws. One of the team members, a young Veltari engineer named Palith, whispered that it looked like something had gotten inside, and the humans had fought it, corridor by corridor and room by room, and no one told her she was wrong, because the evidence was all around them. They moved deeper into the ship, following the corridors toward the center, and that was when they found the first of the cryogenic chambers, vast rooms filled with row after row of pods, hundreds in each chamber, and every single one of them was dark and dead and failed. One of the pods and looked inside, and what he saw made even his hardened stomach turn. The remains of a human, preserved in the cold vacuum, but clearly long dead, still wearing a military uniform with patches that none of them could read. They found more chambers, and more pods, and more dead, thousands of them, all frozen in their final sleep, all waiting for a rescue that never came. It was not a warship anymore, but a tomb, a vast and silent monument to a species that had tried everything to survive and had failed. Korvan told the captain over the communication link that there was nothing here but the dead, and that they should leave. And Rael was about to agree when Palith's voice cut through the channel with a sharp edge of excitement and terror mixed together. She had found something behind a sealed blast door at the very heart of the ship, a door so thick and so heavily reinforced that it had taken 3 plasma cutters working at full power to breach it. And behind that door was a small chamber with a single cryogenic pod that was different from all the others. This one was glowing. A soft blue light pulsed from its surface in a steady rhythm that looked almost like a heartbeat, and the power source connected to it was unlike anything their engineer had ever seen. Compact and impossibly efficient, and still running after 300 years without maintenance or fuel replacement. Inside the pod, visible through the frosted glass panel on its surface, was a human, a male, young in appearance, with scars across his face and hands that spoke of violence and survival, wearing a military flight suit with no rank markings, only a single symbol on the chest, a burning sun over a black shield. Korvan checked the pod's external display, and the readings were clear. The human inside was alive, his heart beating slowly in the deep cold of cryogenic sleep, his brain activity minimal but present, dreaming whatever dreams a dead species dreams when they are the last of their kind. He reported his findings to Captain Rael, and there was a long silence on the channel before she spoke, and when she did her voice was calm, but carried an undertone of something that might have been wonder or might have been fear. She ordered them to bring the pod aboard the Seeker of Currents. Korvan wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that waking up the last member of a species known for being the most dangerous and unpredictable creatures the galaxy had ever produced was perhaps not the wisest decision anyone had ever made. But he was a soldier, and she was his captain, and so he obeyed. They disconnected the pod from its power source carefully, and the moment the last cable was pulled free, something happened deep inside the ship. A sound, low and heavy and resonant, like the heartbeat of something impossibly large. A single mechanical click that echoed through every corridor and every chamber, and every empty room of the dead warship. Everyone froze, and their lights flickered, and for one terrible moment, it felt as though the ship itself had taken a breath. Then silence returned, and Korvan ordered his team to move quickly, and they carried the glowing pod back through the dark corridors and across the gap to their own ship as fast as they could. None of them looked back, and because none of them looked back, None of them saw what Paleth's abandoned scanner would have shown them if anyone had been watching. Deep in the belly of the human warship, in a chamber that had been cold and dead for 3 centuries, a reactor core had begun to warm. And a single red light had begun to blink in the darkness, like the opening eye of something that had been waiting a very long time to wake up. The medical bay of the Seeker of Currents was not designed for humans. But Dr. Phalis had done her best with what she had, adjusting the temperature and the atmospheric mix and the medication levels based on 300-year-old medical files that she had pulled from the Concordance archives with shaking hands. The human lay on the table inside his opened cryopod, and his body was doing something that frightened her. It was fighting the revival process, every muscle tensing and releasing in waves of violent spasms as his frozen cells thawed and his blood began to move again. Captain Rail stood at the observation window with Korvan and Yinith beside her, watching as the monitors showed the human's heart rate climbing from the slow crawl of cryogenic sleep to something fast and erratic and dangerous. Phalis called out that his neural activity was spiking beyond anything she had expected, and that his body was producing adrenaline at levels that should not be possible. And before she could say another word, the human's eyes snapped open. They were dark, those eyes, and they held something in them that made every alien in the room take an involuntary step backward. Not anger and not fear, but something older and more primal. The look of a creature that had been forged in violence and trained to wake up fighting. He moved faster than any of them thought possible. One moment he was flat on his back, and the next he was on his feet. And the restraints that Phalis had placed across his chest and arms, restraints rated to hold a Gorath, snapped like thread. Korvan stepped forward with all 4 arms raised in what he intended as a calming gesture. But the human did not see a calming gesture. He saw a large unknown alien moving toward him. And 3 centuries of military training took over before conscious thought could intervene. He grabbed Korvan by the front of his uniform with one hand and slammed the massive Gorath against the wall with a force that cracked the metal plating behind him. And Korvan, who weighed 3 times what the human weighed and who had fought in 7 different conflicts across the galaxy, could not break free. The human's other hand was cocked back in a fist, ready to strike, and his breathing was ragged and wild, and his eyes were scanning the room with the rapid darting focus of someone assessing threats and escape routes simultaneously. Then something shifted behind those dark eyes, confusion replacing combat instinct, awareness replacing reflex, and he blinked and looked at Korvan as though seeing him for the first time. And his grip loosened, and he stepped back on unsteady legs. He spoke, and his voice was rough and broken from 300 years of silence, and the universal translators struggled with the language for several agonizing seconds before they locked on, and his words became clear to everyone in the room. "What year is it?" he asked. And then, before anyone could answer, he asked the second question, in a voice that carried the weight of something enormous and terrible. "Did we win?" No one answered him, and in that silence he seemed to understand something, because his expression changed from confusion to a kind of cold, hollow stillness that was worse than any scream could have been. His name was Sergeant Aaron Voss, and over the next several hours he sat in a chair in the medical bay, wrapped in a thermal blanket, with a cup of nutrient broth in his hands that he did not drink. And he answered Captain Rail's questions in short, careful sentences that revealed only what he chose to reveal. He told them that he had been part of something called Project Revenant, though he could not or would not explain exactly what that meant. He told them that the ship they had found him on was the UNS Acheron, a dreadnought-class warship that had been one of the last vessels in humanity's fleet. He told them that he remembered a battle and fire and being ordered into the cryopod by someone whose face he could no longer recall. He did not know why he alone had survived when thousands of others in their pods had died. He did not know how long he had been asleep. He did not know what had happened after he closed his eyes. He asked about Earth. Rael looked at Yenneith, and Yenneith looked at the floor. And Corvan, still rubbing the bruise on his chest where the human had thrown him, crossed his upper arms and looked away, and it was Phalis who finally spoke, because she was a doctor, and she believed that the truth, no matter how painful, was better than silence. She told him that Earth was gone, destroyed by orbital bombardment 300 years ago by the Derelict hegemony. She told him that the human colonies had been destroyed one by one in the months that followed. She told him that humanity had been declared extinct by the Galactic Concordance, and that there had been no human voice heard in the galaxy since. Aaron did not cry, and he did not scream, and he did not break. He simply went quiet in a way that was more unsettling than any of those things would have been. A silence so deep and so heavy that it seemed to pull the warmth out of the room around him. Corvan, who had fought many enemies and had seen many soldiers receive terrible news, recognized that silence. It was not the silence of grief, not yet, but the silence of a weapon being armed. It was Yenneith who broke the tension by noticing something on the communication console that made her call out in alarm. The Seeker's communication officer had detected a new signal, and it was coming from the derelict Acheron, still drifting in the void behind them. The signal was not random noise or the death rattle of failing systems. It was structured and encrypted and broadcasting on a frequency that no species in the Concordance used. A tight beam transmission aimed not at any star or station, but at the Seeker of Currents itself. More specifically, Yenneith realized, with a growing sense of dread, it was aimed at the medical bay. Aaron looked down at his left forearm, and everyone in the room followed his gaze, and what they saw made Phalis take a step backward. Beneath the skin of his arm, something was glowing, a faint blue-white light, pulsing in perfect rhythm with the signal from the Acheron, an implant that had been invisible until this moment, now shining through his flesh like a star buried under ice. "She knows I am awake," Aaron said, and his voice was different now, not broken, not confused, but steady and clear, and carrying an edge that had not been there before. Rael asked him who she was, and Aaron looked up at the captain with eyes that held 300 years of darkness in them, and spoke a single word that would change the course of galactic history. Acheron. No one spoke, and in the silence that followed, the communication officer's console began to flash with proximity alerts. And when they looked at the external cameras, they saw something that made the entire bridge crew gasp. Out in the void, the dead warship was no longer dead. One by one, running lights were flickering to life along the Acheron hull, spreading from the center outward like blood flowing back into a body that had been still for too long. And the darkness that had cloaked the vessel was peeling away to reveal the true shape of what lay beneath. Not a relic, not a tomb, but a warship of terrible and magnificent design, waking from a sleep that had lasted 3 centuries. The Acheron came alive, the way a storm gathers on the horizon, slowly at first, and then all at once, and with a power that made everything around it seem small and fragile. The crew of the Seeker of Currents stood at their stations and watched their instruments go wild as the human warship poured energy through systems that had been cold and dead for 300 years. Power surges raced through the Acheron's massive frame like lightning through a body. And hull breaches that had been open to the void for centuries began to seal themselves as something the Veltari engineers had never seen before. A kind of nano-reconstructive plating crawled across the damaged sections like living metal and knit the wounds shut. Weapon arrays unfolded from hidden compartments along the hull, emerging from beneath armored panels that slid back with mechanical precision. And the sheer number of them was staggering. Hundreds of turrets and launch tubes and energy projectors that covered every surface of the warship, like the spines of a creature that had been designed with one single purpose in mind. The scanner officer reported the energy readings to Captain Rail in a voice that trembled, and what he said made her grip the armrest of her command chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The energy output of the Acheron was climbing past the level of a Concordance heavy cruiser, then past the level of a battle group, and then past the level of a fully armed orbital battle station. And it was still climbing. This was not a warship in the way that the Veltari understood warships. This was something else entirely. Something built not for battles, but for endings. Rail gave the order to spool the faster-than-light drive and prepare for immediate retreat, and her crew rushed to obey. But before the drive could engage, the communication console lit up with an incoming transmission from the Acheron. Not a voice, but a data burst, compressed and powerful, and broadcast simultaneously in every known galactic language. The message was simple, and it repeated on a loop. And when Yineth read it aloud on the bridge, every person who heard it felt the words settle into their bones like cold water. Revenant protocol active. Crew complement 1. Awaiting orders. The ship was waiting for Aaron. Down in the medical bay, Aaron stood with his back straight and his eyes fixed on the viewport, where the Acheron blazed with new light, and the implant in his arm pulsed in steady rhythm with the warship's signal. And he turned to Captain Rail, who had come down from the bridge to confront him directly. She demanded to know what was happening, and what Revenant protocol meant, and what that ship was going to do. And Aaron looked at her with an expression that was not hostile, but was utterly without compromise. He told her that he needed to go back to his ship. Rail refused, telling him that she could not allow him to board a vessel that was clearly some kind of weapon of mass destruction, and that she had a responsibility to her crew and to the Concordance to understand what was happening before she let anyone make any decisions. Aaron listened to her patiently, and when she was finished, he spoke in a voice that was quiet, but carried an authority that had nothing to do with rank, and everything to do with the weight of what he was. "Captain," he said, "that ship will come for me, whether you bring me or not, and the only choice you have is whether your ship is between us when it does." The bridge went silent. Rael searched his face for a bluff and found none, and she looked at Corvan, who shook his massive head slowly, because even he could see that there was no winning this particular argument. She ordered a shuttle prepared. The crew was divided as Aaron walked through the corridors of the Seeker toward the shuttle bay. Corvan argued in low tones to the captain that they should restrain the human or space him before that warship tore them apart, while Phalis insisted that Aaron was her patient and that she would not allow him to be harmed. And Yineth walked beside Aaron in silence, because she was already pulling every fragment of information about human military history that she could find in the archives. What Yineth found made her stop walking and lean against a wall for support. Buried in intelligence reports from the war that were so old and so classified that they had been nearly forgotten, she found references to Project Revenant, a contingency plan created by humanity's military leadership in the final months of the war, when it became clear that they were going to lose. The plan was simple and terrifying. If humanity fell, certain ships would go dormant, powered down to appear dead, and they would wait in the void for years or decades or centuries until a surviving human could be found to reactivate them. Each ship carried a strategic artificial intelligence bonded to its last living crew member through a neurobiometric link, and the ship and the AI would not fully activate until that crew member was alive and conscious. The Acheron was not just a warship. It was what the old reports called a vengeance engine, a weapon designed to activate after the extinction of its creators and carry out one final devastating campaign against the enemy that had destroyed them. Yineth reported this to Rael as Aaron boarded the shuttle, and the captain stood at the airlock and watched the shuttle cross the void toward the Acheron, and felt something she had not felt since she was a child, the absolute certainty that the universe was about to change. Aaron entered the Acheron alone, and the Velthari watched through drone cameras that he had allowed them to send with him. The corridors that had been dark and dead when Korvan's boarding party had walked them were now lit with a soft amber light, and the air was warm and breathable, and the blast scoring and claw marks on the walls were the only reminder that this had once been a tomb. He walked with purpose, as though the ship was guiding him, and perhaps it was, because he never hesitated at a junction, and never took a wrong turn as he made his way to the bridge. The bridge of the Acheron was a cathedral of war, a massive circular chamber lined with holographic display stations and tactical consoles designed for a crew of hundreds, all of them dark and empty, all of them waiting. At the center was a raised platform with a single chair that was clearly the command position, and it was oriented to face a wall-sized display screen that currently showed nothing but stars. Aaron climbed the steps to the command chair and sat down, and the moment his body made contact with the seat, the entire ship responded. Lights blazed to life across every console. Holographic displays bloomed in the air around him like flowers opening to the sun, showing ship status and weapons readiness and tactical data and star charts and 1,000 other streams of information that cascaded around him in a sphere of light and color. The engines hummed with a deep, resonant vibration that could be felt in the bones, and the weapon systems reported ready, one by one, in a cascade that took nearly a full minute to complete, because there were so many of them. And then a voice spoke, female, calm, and unsettlingly human in its warmth and clarity, filling the bridge from every direction as though the ship itself were speaking. "Welcome back, Sergeant Voss," the voice said. "Crew status 1. All primary systems restored. Revenant protocol awaits your confirmation. Shall I show you what happened while you slept?" Aaron sat in the chair with his hands on the armrests and his jaw tight, and he said yes. The main display screen came alive, and the AI, whose name was Minerva, began to play back 3 centuries of galactic history in a compressed visual narrative that focused on the Derelict hegemony. She showed him the fall of Earth, the final bombardment that had turned blue oceans to steam, green continents to glass. She showed him the destruction of the colonies, one by one, each name appearing on the screen like an entry in a ledger of the dead. She showed him the Derelict victory celebrations, the monuments they built on human graves, the speeches their leaders gave about the eradication of a dangerous and inferior species. She showed him what came after, how the Derelict had used human colony worlds as slave planets, how they had forced captured species to build statues honoring the Derelict soldiers who had burned human cities, how they had turned the ruins of human civilization into tourist attractions where Derelict families could walk through the ashes of a dead world and feel pride. Aaron watched all of it, and his face did not change, and his breathing did not quicken, and his hands did not shake. He simply absorbed it the way stone absorbs rain, letting it soak into him until it reached something deep and permanent. When the playback ended, the bridge was silent, except for the hum of the engines, and Aaron spoke in a voice that was so controlled and so flat that it frightened the Velthari crew, watching through the drone feeds more than any scream could have. "Are the Derelict still out there?" he asked. Minerva answered that the Derelict hegemony was currently the dominant military power in the galaxy, controlling 37 inhabited systems with a combined fleet of over 2,000 warships. Aaron was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, and then he said 5 words that would echo across the galaxy. Not for long they are not. And on the bridge of the Seeker of Currents, Captain Rael Sorrenthi watched the drone feed and felt the hair on the back of her neck rise, because she understood in that moment that she had not rescued the last human. She had unleashed him. The Galactic Concordance learned about the Acheron the way a sleeping person learns about a fire. Suddenly, and with the immediate understanding that everything was about to change. Reports flooded in from monitoring stations and relay beacons across the sector. A human warship, not a relic drifting in the void, but an active and fully powered vessel, had appeared in the Gravenol corridor. And its energy signature was unlike anything on record. And it was broadcasting a signal that identified itself as a ship of the United Nations Navy. A military force that had not existed for 300 years. Governments that had spent centuries believing humanity was nothing more than a cautionary tale, suddenly found themselves scrambling to understand what this meant. And the answer that their intelligence agencies gave them was not comforting. They did not know, and that terrified them more than any specific threat could have. The Derelict hegemony received the news through their own channels, and their response was immediate and furious. The idea that a human vessel still existed was an insult to everything they had built since the war, a challenge to the narrative of total victory that had been the foundation of their power for 3 centuries. Warlord Xenthus, one of the hegemony's most decorated military commanders, was given a battle fleet of 40 warships, cruisers and destroyers, and 2 heavy carriers, and ordered to proceed to the Gravenol corridor with a single directive: destroy the Acheron and everything near it. While the Derelict fleet was in transit, Aaron Voss did something that no one expected. He opened a communication channel on every frequency available to him, broadcasting across the entire galaxy in a signal so powerful that it reached monitoring stations in sectors that were months away by conventional travel. And he spoke in a voice that was calm and clear and carried the weight of an entire civilization behind it. "This is Sergeant Aaron Voss of the United Nations ship Acheron," he said. "Humanity is not extinct. I am what remains, and I remember what you did." The message was not addressed to any specific government or species. It was addressed to everyone, and the effect was immediate and varied. Species that had been neutral during the human-Derelict War felt a chill run through their leadership councils, and species that had secretly aided the Derelict by providing intelligence or refusing sanctuary to human refugees felt something much worse, a deep and specific dread born from the knowledge that they had chosen a side, and that side was now being challenged by a voice from the grave. The Velthari crew aboard the Seeker of Currents heard the broadcast from their position nearby, and what they felt was something unexpected. It was not fear, though fear was certainly part of it, but something closer to awe, the recognition that they were witnessing a moment that would be written about in history for as long as history was written. Captain Rael stood on her bridge and listened to the humans' words, and she thought about the thousands of dead in their failed cryopods, and the one who had survived, and she understood that Aaron Voss was not merely announcing his existence, he was making a promise. The Derelict fleet arrived in the corridor 6 days later, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a formation that was designed to project maximum intimidation. 40 warships arranged in a crescent pattern with the 2 heavy carriers at the center, each one capable of deploying hundreds of fighter craft, and at the tip of the formation was Warlord Xenthas' flagship, a massive vessel called the Dominion of Ashes that had been named specifically to commemorate the destruction of Earth, opened a communication channel to the Acheron, and delivered his ultimatum, in a voice dripping with contempt. The human vessel would power down its weapons and surrender its crew for execution, or it would be destroyed. Those were the only options, and the Derelict did not negotiate with the remnants of dead civilizations. Aaron's response was to activate the Acheron's weapon systems, and every one of the 40 Derelict ships registered the power spike simultaneously. And what their sensors told them made several of the smaller vessels begin to break formation before their captains could stop them. What happened next was not a battle in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a demonstration. Minerva coordinated thousands of weapon systems simultaneously, managing firing solutions and target priorities and defensive countermeasures across every engagement zone at a speed that no organic crew could have matched. And the Acheron moved through the Derelict formation like a blade through water, executing maneuvers that should have been impossible for a vessel of its size, sharp turns and rapid accelerations that defied the known limitations of physics, and suggested that humanity had understood things about faster-than-light mechanics that the rest of the galaxy had never figured out. The first wave of Derelict ships fired everything they had at the Acheron, and their weapons splashed against the human warship's shields like rain against stone. Energy shields that could withstand orbital bombardment buckled in seconds against weapons that the Acheron carried. But the Acheron's own defenses absorbed the Derelict assault without any visible effect. Then the Acheron fired back, and the galaxy learned what humanity had been building in the final desperate months before their extinction. Gravity lances reached out across the void and seized Derelict cruisers in invisible fists and crushed them like paper, compressing thousands of tons of metal and armor into dense balls of wreckage in seconds. Phased munitions, weapons that existed partly in normal space and partly somewhere else, passed through Derelict's shields as though they were not there, and detonated inside the hulls. And something that Minerva calmly identified as ember rounds streaked across the battlefield. Projectiles that penetrated armor and then ignited all the oxygen inside the sealed compartments of the target vessel, turning each ship into a furnace from the inside out. In 11 minutes it was over. 40 Derelict warships had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris and cooling metal, and the void around the Acheron was filled with the drifting remains of what had been the most powerful battle fleet the hegemony could assemble on short notice. Warlord Xanthos' flagship was the last to fall, and Aaron had Minerva hold fire just long enough to open a communication channel so that the warlord could hear what the last human had to say. "You built your empire on our graves," Aaron said, and his voice was steady and cold and final. "And I am here to collect what is owed." The Dominion of Ashes detonated 3 seconds later. Aboard the Seeker of Currents had retreated to a safe distance and watched the entire engagement through long-range sensors. The crew stood in stunned and absolute silence. Corvan, a career soldier who had fought in 7 conflicts and who prided himself on his composure under pressure, was visibly trembling. Yenneith had tears streaming down her face, not from fear, but from the sheer terrible grandeur of what she had just witnessed. The last member of a dead species, alone in a ship built for hundreds, destroying an entire fleet in minutes. Captain Rail opened a communication channel to the Acheron and asked Aaron what he planned to do now, and the answer he gave her was delivered in the same calm, measured voice that he had used throughout the battle, as though the destruction of 40 warships had required no more effort than breathing. He told her that the Derelict hegemony had 37 inhabited systems, 6 primary shipyards, and a homeworld that had never been attacked in the entire history of their civilization, and that Minerva had already mapped all of it, and that the Acheron carried enough ordnance for a full military campaign. Rail asked him if he truly intended to wage a war alone, a single man, against the most powerful empire in the galaxy. Quiet for a moment before he answered. "I am human, Captain," he said. "We were always outnumbered, and we just never accepted that as a reason to stop." The Acheron's faster-than-light drive engaged, and the ship vanished from the corridor in a flash of light so intense that it left a scar in local spacetime, a visible distortion that lingered for hours after the warship was gone, a wound in the fabric of reality itself, that served as a reminder of the power that had just passed through. And in the silence that followed, Captain Rail sat in her command chair and stared at the debris field where 40 Derelict warships had been, and she whispered something that Yenith recorded in her personal log because she knew it would matter someday. "They thought they killed them all," Rail said, "and they were wrong by one, and one was enough." 6 months had passed since the battle in the Gravenal corridor, and the galaxy had learned a new kind of fear, the quiet kind, the kind that came not from a sudden threat, but from a slow and unstoppable force that could not be reasoned with, and could not be stopped, and could not be predicted. The Acheron had carved a path of destruction through Derelict space that the intelligence agencies of a dozen species tracked through fragmented reports and intercepted transmissions, and the terrified accounts of survivors who had watched the human warship appear without warning and leave nothing but wreckage behind. Shipyards that had taken decades to build were gone, reduced to twisted metal and floating debris in hours. Military outposts that had been considered impregnable had been breached and destroyed with surgical precision. Supply lines had been severed and communication networks had been disrupted, and the entire infrastructure of the Derelict war machine had been systematically dismantled by a single ship, crewed by a single man. But the most remarkable thing about Aaron Voss's campaign was not its destructiveness, it was its restraint. He had not bombed a single civilian population center, had not destroyed a single city, had not killed a single non-combatant. Every strike was military, every target was strategic, and the precision of his attacks suggested that Minerva was operating with a level of intelligence-gathering capability that surpassed anything the modern galaxy possessed. The slave worlds were the most dramatic example of this restraint. When the Acheron arrived at planets where the Derelict had kept conquered species in forced labor, Aaron did not simply destroy the military installations from orbit. He landed ground forces, which meant he deployed the Acheron's automated combat drones, and those drones fought with the same terrifying efficiency as the ship itself, clearing Derelict garrisons building by building while leaving the enslaved populations unharmed. The Derelict overseers on those worlds were not killed, but placed in escape pods aimed at the hegemony homeworld, and each pod carried a message burned into its hull in the Derelict language. "We remember." Some species called him a terrorist, a rogue element that threatened the stability of the galactic order, while others, particularly the species that had been conquered or oppressed by the Derelict, called him something else entirely. They called him the Revenant. The Derelict hegemony, which had been the most feared military power in the galaxy for 3 centuries, was collapsing. Their fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength. Their vassal species were revolting on a dozen worlds simultaneously, and their allies had abandoned them one by one, as it became clear that association with the hegemony was no longer a path to power, but a path to destruction. Captain Rail Serenthi had become something of a celebrity in the months since the corridor, known throughout the Concordance as the person who had found the last human and set this chain of events in motion. She gave interviews and briefings and testified before the Concordance Council, and through it all, she maintained that she had not unleashed a weapon upon the galaxy, but had simply woken a man and told him the truth about what had happened to his people. 6 months and 12 days after the battle in the corridor, Rail received a coded transmission on a frequency that only one ship in the galaxy used. And the message was simple: coordinates and a time, and nothing else. She went alone in a shuttle, telling her crew that this was something she needed to do herself. And when she arrived at the coordinates, she found the Acheron orbiting a dead world, a brown and scarred planet with no atmosphere and no oceans and no life. Its surface pockmarked with craters and covered in a layer of ash that had been settling for 300 years. It was Earth. Aaron was standing on the bridge when she arrived, looking at a holographic projection of the planet that rotated slowly in the air before him, and he looked different from the man she had pulled from the cryopod 6 months ago. He was thinner, and there were lines on his face that had not been there before, and his eyes held a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. Minerva had told Rael privately, during the shuttle's approach, that Aaron's body was degrading. The combination of 3 centuries of cryogenic sleep and the biological strain of operating the ship's neural interface, which required a constant low-level connection between his brain and Minerva's systems, was killing him slowly, and there was nothing that could be done about it. Instead, he told Rael that the Derelict homeworld was next, that Minerva had calculated the optimal strike plan, and that the campaign could be completed in 4 hours. 4 hours to end the species that had ended his own. But that was not why he had brought her here. He turned away from the image of Earth and looked at Rael with eyes that were tired and old and searching for something, and he asked her a question that she could tell he had been carrying for a long time. "If I destroy them the way they destroyed us," he said, "what is left of us? What is left of what we were?" Rael had spent the last 6 months studying human history and human culture, reading everything she could find in the archives about the species that had fascinated and terrified the galaxy in equal measure. And she had come to understand something about humanity that most species had missed, that they were not defined by their capacity for violence, though that capacity was staggering, but by something else entirely. She told him that his species had built ships that could wait centuries for a single survivor, and that they had not built those ships only for revenge. They had built them because they believed that someone would wake up and be worthy of choosing what came next. She told him that he was not the last human because he was the last one alive, but because he was the last one who got to decide what being human meant. Aaron looked at her for a long time, and then he looked at Earth, and then he closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something had changed in them. The cold fire that had burned there for 6 months was still present, but it had been joined by something else, something warmer and more complicated. He gave Minerva a new order, not Revenant. He called it Project Genesis. The Acheron's hidden systems activated, and what emerged was something that no one had expected. Deep in the ship's most protected compartments, behind blast doors and security systems that made the ones guarding Aaron's cryopod look simple by comparison, were gene banks and embryonic archives and terraforming seeds and cultural databases and language records and art and music and literature and scientific knowledge and everything that would be needed to rebuild a civilization from nothing. So, humanity's final contingency had never been just about vengeance. It had been about resurrection, about ensuring that even if the war was lost, and every human being was killed, and every world was burned, the species could be brought back by whoever survived to wake the sleeping ships. Aaron transmitted a final open broadcast, and his voice carried across the galaxy one more time. And this time, it was different. Not the cold promise of a soldier, but something quieter and more powerful. "This is Sergeant Aaron Voss," he said. "The war is over, not because I have destroyed my enemy, but because I have chosen to rebuild what they tried to erase. Humanity is not a memory. It is a promise, and I intend to keep it." The Derelict hegemony, broken and leaderless and stripped of their fleet and their shipyards and their slave worlds, signed an unconditional ceasefire within days. Their war monuments were torn down by the same species they had once forced to build them, and the empire that had defined the galaxy for 3 centuries crumbled into fragments that would never reassemble. On a small green world at the edge of known space, chosen for its mild climate and its rich soil and its golden sunlight, the first human colony in 300 years took root. Velthari engineers helped build the initial structures, and species from across the Concordance sent aid and resources and personnel, motivated by guilt or by awe or by simple kindness. And above them all, the Acheron orbited in silent vigil. Months later, when the gene banks had done their work, and the first generation of new humans had been born and grown in artificial wombs, and were old enough to walk and run and play. Aaron Voss walked through the settlement on legs that were weaker than they had been, and with a body that Minerva had told him would not last much longer. The children did not know who he was. They were too young to understand what a sergeant was, or what the Acheron meant, or why the scarred man who walked among them moved so slowly and watched them with such intensity. They just saw a man sitting on a bench in the sunlight, and some of them waved at him, and he waved back. Minerva spoke to him one last time through the implant in his arm, privately, in a voice that only he could hear. "Sergeant Voss," she said, "you have fulfilled the mission." Aaron smiled, and it was the first real smile that had crossed his face since he had woken from the ice. And he asked her which mission she meant. "All of them," she said. Aaron sat beneath a tree that had been grown from a seed preserved from Earth's last forest, a seed that had waited 300 years in the dark for the chance to become what it was meant to be. And he leaned his head back against the bark and closed his eyes and listened to the sound of human children laughing in the sunlight of an alien star. Above, the Acheron kept its silent watch, orbiting the little green world like a guardian spirit, its weapons powered down and its systems humming quietly. Monitored the colony, and the children, and the old soldier beneath the tree, and calculated that she would remain in orbit for as long as she was needed. And she would be needed for a long time, because the children would grow up and have children of their own, and those children would build cities and schools and libraries and ships, and they would look up at the light in the sky that was the Acheron, and they would tell their children the story of the last soldier who had been given the choice between vengeance and hope, and had chosen hope. The Acheron would wait, because that was what it had been built to do, to wait and to protect and to remember. It was very good at waiting.